one of them. And the last thing I'll say by way of housekeeping, our content, and I am going to turn off my video. Now, I'll bring the video back up at the end when we have a little time at the end for other Q&A besides the chat box that we'll use throughout the presentation. So video will go off and sound will stay on, and here we go. I like to begin with this particular slide for a couple of reasons. One is that I'm guessing that if you signed up for this topic, this might be a theme that you can resonate with. It could be something that you have resonated with for a long time. It could be part of your normal day-to-day life, and that you have a high stress type of job or a high stress type of family life or the combination of both. And so you just feel it day and night. I would also guess that these times and this pandemic situation that we're living in and through have exacerbated and intensified these kinds of feelings of stress, and stress kind of bleeding into our private time and our personal life, and the boundaries from one experience to another, from what's my work day to what's my home day, to what's my family time and what's my professional time and volunteer time and kids' school time, and all of those things kind of merging in together. I do see that we have one person with your hand up. If you have a question or comment, please type it in the chat box and we'll be happy to make sure we acknowledge you. The other reason that I like to start us with this, though, is that it is in the form of a cartoon. And so I hope that even if you were able to resonate with it, it also gave you a moment to smile, maybe laugh, maybe have a little bit of a chuckle, and that's a good thing. And these are difficult and challenging times that we are living through right now. And all of us, you all represent, I know, different community organizations and agencies and ministries and partners in different ways. And times are hard for your own life in many ways, probably, and for the people in the community that you engage with, interact with, and serve. And so a lot of what I'll be going through is how do we mitigate that? How do we mitigate that stress? How do we mitigate the weight and the heaviness of some of what's going on? And I'm going to be sharing a number of different ways, but one of them is that we really do need to notice those moments when we can smile, notice those moments when we can experience some joy, when we can laugh. Humor is a really important part of our own self-care, our own mental health, and to be able to share that with others is an important tool, just as important, even more so, I would say, at times like this as at any other time. So that's why I began with that, and it's I share it because it's kind of like a two-part, it had double meaning, you might say, and that's really what I'm going to suggest. Everything I'll be sharing with you throughout the remainder of our time together is going to kind of have a double meaning, if you will. And one will be, I'm intending and hoping that a lot of it will be things, material, information, ideas, reflections that you can use for yourself and for your own self-care and your own well-being. And then the double piece of it will be things you can pass on and share, whether that's to your family members, whether that your neighbors, or your colleagues that you work with, and perhaps even working with in a virtual way now, as well as the recipients of service that you might provide through your organization. So I hope that everything I share will kind of have that double meaning for you. And I also have this image that hopefully you all can see. It's an image of a hiking trail. And this is the beginning of how I want to frame the content for our time together. So as you can see, this is a little bit of a hiking trail, and we can't even tell if this photograph was taken during the day or at night because the overhead canopy, the foliage, the leaf cover is so dense that we can't even see the sky. So this hiker has very little light to go by except for their own flashlight or lantern, and yet because of that, they can't see many of the curves in the trail ahead. They can't see the next scenic vista they might come along to. They can't see certainly the summit of the trail or the end of the trail. All that this hiker can see is that they have enough light to take one next step. And really, what I want you to be thinking about is that number one, as I take us through the pieces that I'm going to be sharing in our time together. there's so many numbers being just all surrounding us, right? You turn on the news for 5 seconds, numbers are bombarding you. Social media, numbers are bombarding you. There's numbers that are big and growing bigger every day. There's numbers that in some from source to source might be conflicting. There's numbers that are scary and overwhelming and confusing. Numbers about health and even about death, numbers about the economy and dollars, numbers about the needs of your own clients or people that you interact with and engage with and support and serve. That's a lot. And so one of the things I want to share is that a tool to help us in our own well-being and our own self-care as well as for others is if we can bring our mind into focus and focus on one idea, one person, one thing at a time. And so the framing mechanism I have for this, and you will receive it, you'll see it on the slides as we go through, and then you'll receive it as well as a handout, is a series of questions that I've created for your daily use. And the guidance or suggestion that you use these questions a few at a time at different points throughout the day. All the usual boundaries have been blurred, as I mentioned earlier, and it's important in that sort of chaotic, crisis-oriented life that we're in to have rhythm, to have some structure and some rhythm. That's essential for our own health and well-being, as well as will be for anyone we seek to serve and care for. So these questions and using them as a guide for reflection at different benchmarks or mileposts throughout your day help give you a little bit of that sense of rhythm. And then they also can be conversation starters that you in turn can share with others. So I hope you'll find them valuable for both of those purposes. So I'll be sharing a question and then some other content and then a question and then some other content, and we'll go through them like that throughout our time together. And again, I'll just acknowledge, I do see that a couple of people have raised your hands. If you are just saying hello, that's great. If you have something more that's a question, please do send it either privately to Maggie or myself, or else to the group in the chat box. Thank you. So the first question I would like to invite you to consider is, in the morning, every morning when you first get up, to have this question: what is one goal I have for today? Not what is my entire to-do list for the whole day, not what is everything from yesterday's to-do list that I didn't quite get to yet. You know, you may have to get to those questions as you proceed through your day, but start in the morning and focus your mind on what is one goal that I have for today. And just take that reflective moment to focus. I do want to add here that every single one of the questions for reflection and the actions that they then suggest that you can take for yourself and that you can share with others are research-based. So even though they're presented in this way, that's to give some meaning and some reflection to your day and some rhythm and some structure, they also have research behind them that these are tools that help us grow our resilience and grow our well-being, even in the face of difficulty and stress, grief, loss, trauma, the things we'll be talking about. And so just so you know, I sort of take my own advice here. I have one particular goal for this webinar. And that is, I hope that during our time together, each and every person here, and we do have a big group, so I hope each of you in your own way will be able to take at least one thing away that you will say, you know what, that had some value for me, that has some meaning. I'm even gonna reflect on it or try it out in the week ahead. And maybe it's the picture of the hiker in the hiking trail. So maybe you already got your one thing, or maybe it's any of the other things that come along. But I do hope that you are each able to take one idea, one thought, one something, and just really take it away and say, this is something that has some value for me. And as starting your day that way, starting your moment that way, gives you a point of focus and a point of healthy reflection to get the day kicked off. Now, before we go on to other questions, like I said, I'm going to intersperse them with some of the content I wanted to share with you. And here's the first one of those. And this is when I really would hope and invite you to try to find your chat box, make sure you know how to use it and where it is. because I invite you to, as I talk through this slide, think about ways in which this might resonate with you, or any ways you might have noticed some of these responses in yourself or others, and any reflection you'd like to make on that that you would be willing to share with us as a group to just sort of enrich all of our learning opportunity. But these are 6 ways that are very normal for people to respond in times of crisis, particularly prolonged stress or crisis like what we're going through now in this world of pandemic. I want to just say a couple of overarching things. One, none of these ideas are mutually exclusive. So you don't have to pick, well, which one of these am I really? You might notice yourself in 2, 3, 4, or even all of them at different times or in different circumstances. Secondly, none of them are better than any other. It's not that one is the right or better way to respond to crisis and others are just, what other people do, or it's not that other people have the right or better way and you're trying to keep up. There's no comparison, no judgment, just a recognition that there's different ways that we cope with and respond to crisis. And third, that it's helpful to acknowledge these in ourselves and acknowledge the ways we respond to crisis and give ourselves the grace and space to have that. And you're going to hear me use that phrase, grace and space, a few different times during our time together. But to have that ability to recognize our own responses and just sit with them and have that space for them, and then notice them in others as well, so that we can say, oh, how can we learn from each other? How can we collaborate and have community and have relationship with one another where we each can be ourselves and have our own response and help be part of each other's resiliency building and well-being process. So with those as some overarching comments, I'm going to just say a couple of words about each of these. And again, as you're hearing it, if you feel that you resonate in any way or have a comment to make, I would love to have you place that in the chat box. Oh, and they're not in any order here. I guess that was the other thing I'd say. They're not listed in this particular order for any reason. So some of us have a characteristic that drives us to want to make the world a better place or make some part of the world a better place for some number of people or the earth itself. We're fixers. And I would guess that if you're in the different community organizations that you're in that signed on to this particular session, I bet that this describes a lot of you, a lot of us, because it also in some ways describes me. And it can be particularly challenging right now in this pandemic environment for fixers because, whoa, the issues are just so big that it's hard to get our hands on or our minds even wrapped around what is it that needs fixing, or what could I fix, or how can I be part of the fixing of this set of problems that have such enormity and uncertainty with them. So it can be hard to sit with that impulse of being a fixer and kind of not quite knowing how to direct that energy right now. The same could be said about a fighter. The fighter and a fixer are very closely related. A fighter is someone who then has that extra burst of energy that makes you want to be an advocate, a voice for others. Again, I would guess that that's reflective of many of you on this conversation. And again, right now it's a little hard to know, well, what am I fighting either for or against? Where do I focus that energy right now? In times of crisis, everyone needs some calming and some soothing and some comforting. Some of us are good at noticing that and good at paying attention to that and actually attending to that and getting that calming or comforting when we need it. Others of us might be good at helping others to do that, but do we recognize that we need it ourselves? So just kind of check in with yourself and notice, where am I on that continuum? Am I able to get the calming and comforting I need when I need it? Or am I just able to recognize that with others, but not so much myself? So just check in with yourself on that. And the same thing with asking for help. We all, from what I understand of your organizations, we all are in organizations and careers and efforts, programs that encourage others to ask for help and encourage others to recognize this is a strength when you ask for help. And there's certainly no shame in it. It's actually a good quality to have. And yet, again, how do we recognize ourselves in that continuum? Are we able to recognize when we're the one that need help? There's adapters. So whereas the fix-it person and the fighter are kind of turning the attention externally, seeing what's out there, seeing what's the crisis, what's the problem, and then wanting to dive in and fix it or fight it, the adapter is looking more internally and saying, okay, that's what's out there. How do I adapt? And I would suggest to you that adapters are having a particularly difficult time right now because, wow, everything is just changing and is so uncertain from moment to moment, from day to day. It's like riding a choppy set of waves and never knowing when we're going to just kind of be thrown into the air from a wave and when we're going to be wrapped under the curl of the wave. It's very uncertain and it's very challenging to figure out how can I adapt when I don't even know what I'm adapting to. I hear this term or this phrase, the new normal, but what is that exactly? What does it look like? When is it coming? You know, will it ever really come? So that adapting quality is a little hard to engage right now, and that can leave us feeling disquieted. And then doing nothing. Now, the other overarching comment that I didn't quite make at the beginning that I wanted to save and make here is that all of these responses to crisis are strength-based or can be part of our strength and part of our own path towards resilience. Whether they seem or sound that way on the surface or not, they're all strengths or all demonstrate the potential of strengths within us. And that goes for this last one too, which is do nothing. Which means that some of us have that capacity when we recognize there's a big storm a-coming or upon us already, and I know how to hunker down and ride out the storm. And that hunkering down and riding it out and being safe and keeping others safe is also a really great skill to have or response to have. So I'm going to move us along in a moment, but I am going to take a pause here. I didn't see yet any comments in the chat box about this, but I'm going to take a pause, take a sip of my own beverage, and ask if anyone has any reflections here. Do you recognize yourself in any of these responses? Anything you want to reflect on, just feel free to type something in the chat box. Okay, not seeing any at the moment. I'm going to keep us going, but at any point in time, again, feel free and please do use that function so we can have some interaction. I'm going to take us, I see a comment now, someone who's saying, you see yourself mostly in the fix-it category. And like I said, I think that's probably very likely to be true for people that are in this kind of lines of work that we all are. Another comment about that how it's hard to be an adapter is resonating today. Yeah, and especially as this becomes more and more prolonged, it's not just this short crisis, it's dragging out. How do we adapt? That's a really, really important comment. And another person is saying, it's interesting to think about the variety of approaches and how we can fall into several categories depending not only on the day, but the hour. So thank you for noticing that this is how we can shift in our responses even from hour to hour, never mind from day to day. Now, I have noticed that so far, those of you that are commenting have your settings, so you're only commenting to me, and that's great. I can see it. I'm not mentioning your names in case you're trying to stay anonymous, but if you do want to respond to the whole group, you can make sure you check the drop-down box that says all panelists and attendees. So some other people that are saying they see themselves more and more trying to adapt, where others are in that denial, I'm just pretending it's not happening. And that's kind of part of the hunkering down and the doing nothing to get through it safely. And again, that's perfectly okay. So feel free to keep typing things in, but we're going to move on, and I'm going to take you to our second question. This would also be one for the morning reflection to start your day. So you've asked yourself, what is one goal I have for today? Next, who is one person I can turn to for support today? Now, this is a valuable question all the time, pandemic or not, right? We all need to know that we're not in this life alone. We're not in this journey alone. We're not carrying whatever burden we might be carrying alone. This is certainly something that for Mental Health Month, we want to help everyone recognize you're not alone. And yet we're in this time frame where it's called social distancing. It shouldn't be called that, in my opinion. It should be called physical distancing. We need to be physically apart from others, but we should be relationally and socially continuing to connect. But it can feel very isolating, and for some more so than others. So we want to have at the very beginning of our day a reminder that I'm not alone. So who's just at least one person that I can turn to for support on this day? And it might be a different person from day to day, and it might even be a different person than who your usual support person might be, because of the nature of the crisis that we're in. Maybe the usual people that you would turn to for support are not as accessible, or are caught up and wrapped up in their own response to crisis, not as there for you as they might be. So how can I be creative in thinking about who is that person I could turn to for support? Maybe it's even a neighbor that I'm going to check in on, but I could ask if we could have that be mutual and she could check in on me too. Maybe it's a teenager in my house that can help me learn how to do the technology so I can be part of these virtual conversations. Be creative in thinking about who can I turn to for support. And then as you work with the families and individuals in your community that you serve, help them to think about how they can start their day, no matter how alone they might feel, identifying at least one person somewhere, somehow, whether they live in the same environment with them or not, that they can feel a connection with and can turn to for support. Now we're going to go a little further into our content, and what I wanted to share is that I am going to be looking at some definitions of terms and thoughts around these topics of stress, grief, loss, and trauma, as promised in the title of this session. But it's not a workshop per se about these topics. And I'm guessing that given the kind of organizations you're part of, that you know quite a bit about these topics already. So what I would like to ask you to do as we get into these definitions and reflections is to have an overarching question, excuse me, in your own mind. And that would be to say, how does reflecting on this information right now, how does revisiting it right now today help me to understand myself, my own response that I'm having during this time? And how does it help me understand others, whether in my home and family or in my community, in my circle of care? So it's not that I expect all of this, or however much of it, to be new to you, but rather I'd like you to have that question in your mind. How does revisiting or reflecting on each of these terms and what's behind them and what goes with them, how does that help you understand your own responses that you're experiencing and those of others? But before we start getting into the definitions, we're going to do a couple of polls. I hope that most of you have had a chance to get used to using these virtual platforms and doing polls, but hope most of you will be able to see a poll question pop up in just a moment when I hit the button. And there'll be multiple choice. You just click which one you want to answer. When I then share the answers, no one's name will be associated with any of them. It will all be totally anonymous. For those of you that are calling in from the phone or in other ways unable to see it, I will be reading it aloud as well. So I'm going to launch it now, the first one. And the first one says, grief is a process with recognizable stages which A, proceed in a linear fashion, or B, are not linear and can be experienced differently by different people. C, only occur after death. Other losses are not experienced as grief. Or D, generally lasts about a year. So I'll give you about 30 more seconds to respond. Okay, great. About 2/3 of you have responded. I'll just wait a few more seconds and then close this one out. And ending it now. And you can see the response there is that of those who responded, 100% of you said that grief is a process with stages that are not linear and can be experienced differently by different people. And that is absolutely correct. although if you had picked proceed in a linear fashion, it wouldn't necessarily mean you were wrong. It could be true for you or for someone. It's just in general, they don't always proceed in a linear fashion. So we're going to stop that one. We're going to do two more of these for now, and then we'll have some later. So this one is about a specific type of grief known as ambiguous grief. And so this one says ambiguous grief occurs when A, you're not sure why you're grieving. B, there is nothing to grieve about, but you are still down or depressed. C, the stages of grief are not playing out in the usual manner. Or D, you are experiencing a loss not acknowledged by others. So again, I'll be quiet for about 30 seconds while you reply. Okay, we've got almost 2/3 of you, and I am going to close this one out and share the results. So here we had somebody chose every answer, and it is kind of an ambiguous question, a little more challenging to answer. The majority of those of you who answered said ambiguous grief occurs when you're not sure why you're grieving, but it's actually the second most chosen answer. You are experiencing a loss not acknowledged by others. That is the definition, and I will come back to that in a moment after we do one more poll question. So here's our third poll question. This one is on secondary trauma, and it says secondary trauma is A, less severe than primary trauma, B, not something children experience, C, results from continuous or frequent exposure to other people's trauma, or D, happens when you have a memory of a past trauma. So again, I'll wait about 30 seconds to give you an opportunity to respond. Okay, we've had a good number of responses. I'll give you just a few more seconds. And I'll close this one out, share the results. So we had answers across many of the selections, but the majority that replied did say that secondary trauma results from continuous or frequent exposure to other people's trauma, and that would be correct. That is the definition that I'm going for here. I would like to acknowledge that some responded that it happens when you have a memory of a past trauma, and just to say that when we have a memory, or more likely even a re-experiencing or reliving of a past trauma, that is generally referred to as a trauma trigger or a trauma reminder. And we can have trauma triggers or reminders in secondary trauma. So they're very interrelated, but not exactly the same thing. All right, that's all we're going to do for polls right now, but we will have a few more as the session goes on. Let's begin looking at some of these. And again, please remember the overarching question I asked you to keep in mind. How does looking at this information right now help me understand my own responses or those of others to this current pandemic environment that we're in? Sometimes I ask people, would you like to have a life without stress? And I've had lots of people say, oh, sign me up. That would be great. But in reality, we actually need stress, some level of stress, to survive. There's a type of stress called positive stress that not only kind of energizes and excites us, and motivates us sometimes, but actually promotes growth. So we actually need it for our health and well-being. And I'm going to go on and say a few words about the other two types of stress on here. While I do, I would love to invite some of you to please remark in the chat box. What are some of your examples of positive stress? Things that excite, energize, or motivate you and help you to grow that happen in your life. So while you're collecting your thoughts and typing some things, hopefully into the chat box, I'll just say a few words about the other two. Tolerable stress, not so much. It's not something that we really need. It doesn't necessarily promote growth, but it is normal. It's a normal, natural reaction to a difficult or challenging situation or a negative experience. But the reason that we're calling it tolerable is because usually we can cope with it and get through it using our own natural coping mechanisms or support system without necessarily needing outside intervention. When it becomes toxic, I mean, just the word toxic, we understand, is something that is, basically poisoning us, and it moves into the world of trauma, which we will talk more about in a couple of minutes. Now, let me see what some of you are saying in regard to positive stress. Having a baby, or in any way welcoming a new person into your circle of close family connections, definitely a positive stress. Organizing a big event, whether that's a fundraiser or a birthday party or a wedding, all of those can be positive stresses. Learning new computer skills. Yeah, learning any new set of skills can be challenging, can be stressful, but can really be positive, and we can feel good about ourselves as we accomplish it, including wanting to do a good job. And reaching out and helping someone, which is great that you said that. You're going to see me post something about that in just a few minutes, that importance of helping others. So those are all great examples of positive stresses that actually benefit us and help us to grow. Tolerable stresses can be more like the end, instead of a bringing on of a new relationship, like having a baby or something. It could be the ending of a relationship, maybe a breakup. It could be when we've planned that big special event, but then it didn't go well, or it got rained out or something like that. Or when we had a presentation, someone mentioned positive stress is doing a presentation. Maybe if the technology doesn't work or something, then it becomes a tolerable stress. So positive and tolerable can be very closely related, just kind of part of a continuum. But sometimes we experience stress as a result of loss. And that's where a lot of people are in this current circumstance. So loss is generally defined as being deprived of someone or something of value to you. So just let that, sort of soak in for a minute and think about how that relates or resonates to what we're collectively going through now, right? And the loss is when we're deprived of this someone or something because it either leaves you or is taken from you in an unanticipated way. And wow, isn't that what's really happening in these times right now under these pandemic circumstances? People or things are being taken, whether your job has been taken, or your prom, or your graduation, or your health, or your business, or the life of someone you love. Something or someone has been taken from pretty much everyone because of this pandemic, and none of it was anticipated. And then there's one more piece about loss that I wanted to add here, and that is what helps define something as being an actual loss is when it's seemingly unrecoverable, and that's when loss moves us in the direction of grief. Because grief really is defined as a reaction to loss, and that is felt and experienced with our whole being, body, mind, spirit, relationships, behaviors, feelings, everything, seemingly unrecoverable. And isn't that kind of what we're facing now, and what many of the people you serve in the community are facing, that short of a death, and some people are experiencing death right now, but separate from the deaths that some are experiencing, everything else is up in the air. We don't know yet. Is this a recoverable loss or unrecoverable? Even if it is recovered, what will it look like? What will it feel like? When will it be recoverable? Will it be the same? And so it's when we have that layer of loss that it does move us into grief. And the stages of grief that I shared about in the poll, and that you all got the response to, that these stages are helpful to know about, although they are not a linear process that everyone experiences in the same way. I'm going to see a comment here. Things that are seemingly unrecoverable are becoming more real to us now. Yeah, and so it's been this long stretch. Some of the newness or the short-term crisis orientation that we might have had at the beginning of this pandemic time is kind of wearing off, and we're getting more into the grind of it, into the ditch of it, and recognizing, wow, some of these things might be unrecoverable, and that's certainly what many of you may be experiencing in your work and in your organizations and agencies. So understanding and seeing, again, for yourself and for those that you work with and serve, how these stages are kind of playing out can be a useful way again, to reflect and to begin to organize your ideas about what you can then do to move forward. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler are the ones that first wrote about these stages. And David Kessler was interviewed just since the pandemic started. He was interviewed for an article in the Harvard Business Review called "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." I hope you may have read it. If not, I hope you will. It's a good little short article. But I want to read you one paragraph from it in which David Kessler does talk about these stages in terms of the current situation with the pandemic. He has already described how, people are kind of experiencing grief right now. And so the author of the article, Scott Bernardo, asks him, well, then what can individuals do to manage all of this grief? And here is Kessler's reply. Understanding the stages of grief is a start. But whenever I talk about the stages of grief, I have to remind people that the stages aren't linear and may not happen in this order. It's not a map, but it does provide some scaffolding for this unknown world. I love that distinction there, map versus scaffolding. So then let's look at how it could potentially play out in this moment. There can be denial, especially a lot of us may have been in that early on. I saw that one of you mentioned it earlier in your response to crisis in the comments. This virus won't affect me or my family or my community. Initially we might have been able to say, well, it's in China or it's in Seattle. It's not here. Then there can be anger when we realize, what, it is affecting me. It is affecting my community. And I'm being made to do things I don't want to do, or being made to give up things I don't want to give up. You're taking away my activities. I'm angry. There can be that bargaining time when it's kind of like, okay, I get it. I have to do these things. I have to social distance. I have to wear this mask. I have to do these things. And if I do them for 2 weeks, 30 days, some set amount of time, that's me doing my part of it. And then universe, you'll do your part, right? And everything will be better after that. And then there's sort of this realization that, nope, just because I kept my share of the bargain doesn't mean everything's going to get better in that set period of time. So I can be sad or even depressed. I don't know when this will end. I don't know how this will end. I don't know what it will look like when it does end. I'm sad. There can be that moment then where you move towards acceptance, and that's that adapter part of our nature that we talked about earlier, that, okay, I can learn how to do my work virtually. I can learn how to remember to bring a mask with me everywhere I go. I can learn these things. I can adapt. I can accept. And at some point for some, there can be that making of meaning, and I'm going to circle back to that in a few minutes. I'm just going to leave it there now. What I want you to also recognize is that all of this about grief is normal, and it is a dynamic process. It's something we move through grief. We shouldn't feel that we're stuck in it, even when it seems like we're stuck in a particular part of it, to give ourselves the grace and space to know that, okay, I might be kind of stuck in this spot for now, but I am going to move through this. There is going to be light at the end of my tunnel, even if I can't see it yet. And this is the last slide I have about grief. I'm going to say a few words about this and then pause and again see if there's any other reflections anyone wants to offer. But I wanted to identify that there are multiple kinds of grief, that people who study grief know that there's many more than what I've listed here, many, many more types of grief than what are listed here. But here are some that are particularly relevant in this particular moment in time. So quote unquote normal grief, and I do have it in quote marks for a reason, because again, everyone is unique and different. But that's kind of what we just got through going over those stages. It's kind of what we think about the general concept of grief when we hear that word. Ambiguous or disenfranchised grief, which I asked about in the poll question, is defined as a grief or a loss that is not acknowledged by others. So in the non-pandemic world, this could be a situation where, for example, you could have just learned that an ex that you had many years ago, and that maybe even your current circle of friends don't even really know about, but you just found out that this ex died and you're kind of grieving that loss, but no one else around you is really even acknowledging that it should be a loss for you to grieve. I have a friend who told me just this week that her mother passed away, that she has been estranged from for over 30 years because her mother was very abusive to her. But she finds herself grieving this loss, but people around her saying, "Oh, you grieved her long ago. You haven't even seen her in all these years. Like, you don't need to grieve now." So those are some examples of ambiguous or disenfranchised loss just in the general realm of life. And another way you can sort of recognize when that's what's happening is if the phrase "at least" creeps into anyone's response to someone else's loss. And Brene Brown talks about this in her work on empathy, if you're familiar with that. But if someone sort of shares a feeling or experience and your response is to think, well, at least it's not as bad as something else that could have happened, or at least you're not going through what that other person is going through. And that's where we're hitting up against this ambiguous grief a lot right now in this pandemic climate, because there are these big giant losses of death, death, death. Every day on the news, the numbers are just piling up and accumulating. And then other huge losses, like people losing their whole business that they invested their whole life into. And so as we see those levels of loss, sometimes it can be easy to think to ourselves or to others, well, at least I'm not going through that, so I can't really complain about, not being able, my daughter doesn't have her prom, or, I can't go out to the movies once a week for my own self-care plan. But yeah, you can acknowledge that. It's okay. And not only you can, but you need to. We all need to. We need to be able to acknowledge our losses, our griefs, to give them voice and to acknowledge them for others and not minimize or disenfranchise anyone's loss. It's not a comparison. It's not a race. It's not something that we should be measuring against anyone else. Now, complicated or traumatic grief is a lot of what you might be experiencing, especially in your work with people in your community who have trauma, and then this grief is layered on top of trauma. And then just two others I wanted to highlight here. Anticipatory grief, again, in the non-pandemic world, would be something along the lines of you find out that someone you care about, it's time for them to go into hospice. And so they're going to die, and you're kind of grieving them before they're even gone. That's an anticipatory grief. But in our world right now, this is really a lot of what's happening, is this anticipatory grief of, when is that next shoe going to drop? When is the next phase of the crisis going to occur? Everyone's got this sort of collective holding of breath and hyper alertness for that next moment of loss. And then there's collective grief, which sounds on the surface like it can be a good thing, and it can. It has that side to it, that sense that we're all in this together. And you see a lot of those responses from celebrities and others, we're all in this together, we support each other. And there is that level which can be really valuable. But there are also sometimes that we have to take care that we're not using that sense that, okay, we're all having this collective grief as just a big blanket we're putting on everyone, and then disenfranchising their grief. Because you know what, we may all be going through the same pandemic, but we're really not all in it together. There are definite and deep inequities, racial inequities, socioeconomic inequities, and other kinds of inequities in the ways that people are experiencing this moment. And so, although there's a collective nature to it, there's also a nature that says we're not really all in this together. And someone has asked if I can say a bit more about complicated grief. So complicated grief is when there's grief and trauma that complicate each other. So it's often when there's, and I'm going to say a bit more about trauma in a moment, but it's when someone who's supposed to support you or help you is the one that's harming you. And so the grief becomes complicated by trauma. And I will just say a bit more about that in a moment when we get to the trauma definitions, which we will do right after we do our next of our reflective questions. But before I get to that, I am going to put a pause on this grief section. And other than that question, which I'll get to more about complicated and traumatic grief, does anyone have any other questions or comments about your experience with grief or how I've described it that you'd like to share now? And please feel free to continue doing that, but I am going to saying this, that we're all in this together, is easy to say when you have the means and privilege to survive, financial and other kinds of privilege, absolutely. And that's why I really wanted to call our attention to it, that while there is this collective nature of everyone kind of going through something, we're not all in it together. We're not all having the same exposure, and we can't minimize or disenfranchise the struggle that some are going through that are at deeper levels than others of us. So thank you for that comment. The third of the daily reflection questions is for, again, it's the last one for first thing in the morning. So there was the morning question about what is one goal I have for today, and what is who is one person I can turn to for support. And now the third question is, and this came up in someone's comments, but how will I reach out to one person today? And so while you're kind of thinking on that, I see there's a couple other comments. Ambiguous grief question definition was helpful to someone, so that's great. And being sensitive to this with your kids. Yeah, they're grieving, even though you're not always sure why, or it's not at the same level that someone else. Someone mentioned that the phrase around collective grief that you've heard is that we're all in the same storm but different ships, or some have ships and some have rafts and some don't even have a raft. Yeah, so that is a way to describe that. Our culture does a poor job of acknowledging grief, someone wrote in the comments. We need to be sensitive towards acknowledging all the feelings, right? And that's why this phrase that I sort of keep coming back to, giving each other grace and space, is a really important piece to this process. So the last of the morning questions, how will I reach out to one person today? Again, focusing in on one, even if you have more than one person that you do need to reach out to, starting with that focus on who's at least one person that I can and will reach out to, and being concrete about how I will do that. Do I have a question to ask that person? Do I have a concern to explore? Can I offer a support or a resource? So just really focusing in on one person at a time. The beautiful thing about this is that reaching out to others, of course, is intended to help that other person, but it also benefits us. And I believe that came up in someone's comments in the feedback a few minutes ago. But there's research about this too, that reaching out can actually be part of your own self-care plan. It is actually boosting to your own resilience and well-being when you help others. And so that's also something you can share with clients or people that you work with. We're going to continue looking at definitions, and I am going to take us into that trauma piece just for a few minutes. This is not a whole workshop on trauma, but again, I invite you to have that overarching question about how does thinking through this and reflecting on this now help me to understand better either my own responses or those of others around me or those that I serve. And that's where I will get a little more to that complicated grief piece as well that was asked about. So first we want to notice that trauma can be experienced by different individuals and groups, right? And a single child, a single adult, or a whole family or community, or across multiple generations. And when trauma comes upon you, it can have that feeling of being like a storm that just came into your life. And so that's why I use storm imagery here to remind us that there's multiple kinds of trauma. Acute being that one-time thing that might happen. Chronic, something that's ongoing, like bullying or domestic violence. Now, complex is also that complicated grief or trauma that came up a few minutes ago. So this is now also in response to the question. It's complex when someone who was supposed to be in a position of providing care or support or protection actually does the harm or doesn't mitigate the harm. So we often think about this, for example, when we see adults who don't care for their children, child abuse or child neglect. And so the adult who's supposed to be caring for the child is actually harming them or not protecting them. That's a form of complex or complicated grief and loss and trauma there. But it also means anyone that's in a position in the culture, so whether you're a teacher or a therapist or a counselor or a coach, whether you're a pastor or a priest, whether you're in law enforcement, whether you're a medical doctor, all of those roles in society are people whose main function is to provide protection and care for others. And so if you end up being harmed by or not protected by someone who has that role, it adds complexity and complication to your experience of grief or to your experience of trauma. And then that historical or multi-generational, when it happens across time, often systemic racism is one of our deepest examples of that, but there are many others. And that's why, explains a lot about why we have so many inequities, even in the current pandemic. And then secondary or vicarious trauma, which you all, I believe all of you got the answer in the poll question, that it's the frequent or continuous exposure to other people's trauma. And it gets complicated at times like this because it's like all these trauma storms are happening to everybody all at once. Whew, that's a lot. And we know that trauma actually changes the brain. It actually changes the brain pathways. It not only changes it in the moment. So this is a snapshot of an in the moment. Okay, person on the right has a brain with no trauma occurring, that all that yellow part is lit up. They can do constructive problem solving and rational thinking and reasonable thinking and cause and effect and everything we kind of put in the term executive function. And then the brain on the left is the one where, bam, a trauma has happened, and a experience has happened that causes us to go into survival mode. And so all of that thinking part of our brain literally shuts down and we go into survival mode. And perhaps you've noticed that for yourself. And you might be familiar with these top 3 especially types of ways our brain can react in terms of survival brain. You go into fight mode, you go into flight, you want to escape, get away from it. Freeze, shut down. And 3 other modes have also been identified by those who study this. And one is the flock, and it's that need to just come together and be with others in the moment of crisis. You see that a lot when there is a crisis, like a shooting or something, and everyone just comes and flocks around that exact corner on the sidewalk. And yet we can't do that right now. So that's part of what makes things really difficult now, right? And then there's this flap or frenzy mode, and it's kind of pictured by these birds here. It's when our brain kind of gets into overdrive and we have all this nervous energy and we're not really into fight yet and we're not fleeing, but we're kind of unfocused energy and activity. And then we have the fawn response, which is the mode when, in order to, and again, these aren't thought out consciously, they're just the brain goes into one of these modes in time of crisis. But the fawn mode is when we, in order to stay safe, my best response is to have no voice and to not be able to say no and just merge my personality into my abuser or the one harming me. To be a pleaser is another way it's been described. To not have a voice of my own, to not stand up for myself. And so we can see that these are all different responses to being in that survival brain, to being in that survival mode, place. And so I'm wondering if any of you have recognized yourself sort of perhaps being a little off, a little fuzzy, a little less productive perhaps than usual, maybe a bundle of nervous energy. Any of these things, if describe how you've been feeling in your thoughts or your feelings or your behaviors, recognize that that's normal. Give yourself some grace and space to know that that's normal, and that it's okay, and that you just need to acknowledge that it's because you're in this survival brain a lot of the time, and so are the families and community members that we serve. So this has been pretty heavy, that part, and I apologize, but we need to understand that in order to emerge from it. And so now I'm going to take us for the rest of our time together in a different direction in terms of what helps us build the resilience we need to have health and well-being come from this, and what helps us to help others. So the really good news is that brains, even though all those things I just talked about actually harm our brain and cause disconnection and overloading and flooding out of neurotransmitters that we need for our own health and well-being, the same can be said that our brains are always under construction, not just babies' brains, but everyone's brains. So we're going to do one poll question right here, and it's just a true or false kind of question. If I can find it. Okay, here it is. Resilience is a character trait that some people have and others don't. True or false? Okay, about 2/3 of you have replied. I'll give about 10 more seconds for others. And I'll close it out now. We had about 3/4 of you that did reply. And of those that replied, 3/4 of those who replied said it's a false statement, which would be accurate. Um, and however, the significant number, 25% of you that said it sounded like a true statement. Don't feel bad about that because that certainly has been the conventional wisdom. It's often also what we observe. We're just beginning really to learn more about resilience. And we don't know nearly enough about resilience, to tell you the truth. It is one of those things that's still on the cusp of scientific inquiry. But what we do know is that it's not something you're either born with or not, that everyone has that capacity to have resilience and to nurture and develop and strengthen resilience, or that we all have ways that we can nurture and strengthen resilience in others. We can be part of that healing for others as well. So, um, it's the most hopeful thing I think that I can be sharing right now, is that harm that comes to our brain and to our being from the loss and grief and trauma that I was sharing about earlier. We can emerge from that not only with resilience but with growth. And this term is especially one I want you to think about, post-traumatic growth, that we don't have to just try to set our sights on kind of surviving and getting through these times. We don't just have to hope we can kind of come out the other end of this, a little bit not the worse for the wear. We can actually strive for or believe in the possibility of positive transformational growth. And that's what I hope you want for yourself, but also for the people that you serve and that you work with. And that's what the remainder of our time will be, sort of what helps us to get there, so that we do have that deeper appreciation of life, and deeper or better relationships with others, and hope and optimism for possibilities in our own life, and recognition of our own personal strengths, and the spiritual change that helps us sense our own, deepen our sense of our own being in the world. And especially when we think about secondary trauma, this shows up when we often can just look at the words on the right and say, oh, it's about burnout, it's about trauma, it's about fatigue, it sounds so heavy. But to look at the terms on the left as well and say, and there can be compassion, satisfaction, and empathy, and resilience and growth that can come from times like these. But what I want you to hear is that it doesn't generally happen automatically. We have to have intent. And so these next pieces that I'll be sharing are about having that sense of intentionality as you work through, how do I care for myself? And then in order to care for others, to lead us to these places of growth. So that's what we're moving into now. How do I have that intentionality to move myself and others to this place of both resilience and growth? And I just wanted to acknowledge that children can experience secondary trauma too. We often think of secondary trauma as something, or children as having primary trauma if they're abused or neglected, but we don't always recognize that they can also be exposed to and experience and absorb the experience of being exposed to other people's pain and other people's trauma. And that's especially a lot of what's happening now. So we have to be aware of that. We have to recognize the warning signs, develop the awareness through definitions. That's why I spent time on that. Through knowing ourselves and our own warning signs, like what are my warning signs? How do I know when I'm getting a little overloaded? Do I get cranky? Do I get grumpy? Do I eat more? Do I eat less? Do I sleep more? Do I sleep less? Do I shut down? Do I cry a lot? Just kind of noticing your own warning signs, and then starting to be aware of noticing them in others, not just in your immediate circle of your friends and family, and then those you work with in your professional life, but also people you just encounter in the community. So I'm going to share one little story here about a clerk or a cashier to help make this point a little more. So I have a daughter who's now in her 40s, but she was adopted by our family when she was 16. She had had a lot of years of history of lots of trauma. She has mental health diagnoses. She has cognitive challenges. And she lost her job during this pandemic. And so it's all of that contributes to this being an especially difficult time for her. And she went out to the CVS one day to get something. And then she came back and she called me on the phone and she said, "You know what, Mom? That cashier in that CVS was so rude to me. Why do people have to be so rude, especially at times like this? Don't they know that everyone is just so stressed? Why would they have to be rude to me like that?" So the first thing I needed to do, in this phrase that I've said to you on this webinar over and over, is give her grace and space to be able to express those feelings and to know that she was heard. But then also to not let her stay stuck there. So to help pull her back into balance and have that next phase of the conversation after I let her be heard and understood, then to also say, I wonder if that cashier, if it's hard for her to go to work every day in this pandemic. I wonder if she's worried about catching the virus from customers or leaving her own kids at home while she goes to work. I wonder if it's hard for her. And just engaging in that conversation that can lead to the building of compassion and empathy. That's part of what helps. Now, I've included, when you get your materials from signing up for this webinar, you'll get some handouts that help you think through, again, recognizing your warning signs. What are the impacts across your own life domains that secondary trauma might have on you in your professional life? There's even a survey that you can take called the ProQual that helps you understand the impact that being constantly exposed perhaps to other people's trauma might have on you. So I encourage you to use that, but only use it if you use it in this way, that you look at it over time. That you don't just look at a one point in time, because that really, like the dots on this slide, that doesn't tell us a whole lot. Any one of those dots doesn't tell us much. It's only when we really can see the trend over time that we know kind of, are we growing and moving in the right direction, even if we have an occasional setback, or is something indicating that maybe things are going the wrong way and I need to make some change. We also want to listen to the signs our own body is telling us. And especially during these times when it's hard uh, to absorb everything in cognitive ways, much of what's happening we're absorbing in our body. And so we want to listen to those signs of our body, and we also want to understand that as much as we might experience loss and grief and trauma in our body, we can also experience resilience and healing through our body. I'm going to do a couple more poll questions in a moment, but first I wanted to take us to these next couple of our daily reflection questions. And that would be one, and these three questions here, this one and the next slide, I would suggest that you do around lunchtime. Have these questions around that lunchtime of day, take a little break, a little time for some reflection, and then ask yourself, what is one way I'm going to nourish and move, and I would add hydrate, nourish, move, and hydrate my body today? Whether or not I can stick to some, big fitness plan or eating plan, is there at least one way for today that I'm going to nourish and move my body? And at the same time as reflecting on that, also reflect on, what is one way I will nourish my spirit and my mind today? Again, that focus on one. And then do whatever the answer is to these questions, do the thing that the answer suggests. So that's part of how you do your self-care and how you then equip yourself to care better for others. And it's kind of like the title to that book, Eat, Pray, Love. I'm not talking even about the content of the book, but just the idea that boil it down to the basics, just nourish your body and nourish your mind and nourish your spirit. So we are going to look at a couple poll questions here and then move along. So stop sharing that one. Okay, the next one we're going to look at, this one about the body. It's important to move your body during periods of stress, grief, or trauma because A, trauma and grief are stored in your body and movement helps with coping and healing. Or B, you might gain weight from stress eating and being less active than usual. Or C, if you're exposed to the COVID virus, you can sweat it out and won't get sick. Or D, none of the above. So just give you about 30 seconds for that. Okay, I'm going to pause, stop this one, and share the results. So yes, the majority, almost all of you, 95%, said it's important to move your body because trauma and grief are stored in your body, and movement does help with coping and healing. And so for those of you who said none of the above, maybe that's because it doesn't feel like that works for you, and that's fine. You need to know yourself. But just know that in general, this is evidence-based information that for most people, trauma and loss and grief can be stored in your body. And so using and moving your body can help with coping and healing. And it can also be true that when we're not as active as we usually might be, we could gain some weight or something. And so it's certainly not a bad idea to just get some movement for health reasons as well. So we'll stop sharing that one. We're going to do another one. All right, this is one I'll talk a bit more about in a few minutes, but let's do the question for now. Saying aloud or writing down difficult or negative feelings, A, should be discouraged because it leads to more negative thinking. B, is healthy because it helps you not to get stuck in the negative space. C, should only be done when you're not around children so you don't expose them to negative thoughts. Or D, is safe only when done in a therapist's office. Okay, just a few more seconds I'll allow for this. We've got about 2/3 of you have replied. About 10 more seconds. Okay, and I'll close this one out. And we can see that 98% of those who responded said that saying aloud or writing down difficult or negative feelings is healthy because it helps you not to get stuck in that negative space. Exactly, and that's true for adults and for children. Um, and so that's that next response that some indicated shouldn't be done around children, not to expose them to negative thoughts. We don't want to overexpose. And as I mentioned before, children themselves can experience secondary trauma, but we want to give them that space where they can see you as a role model, that you can express the full range of human emotions, but you don't get stuck in them yourself, and that they have the opportunity to do that as well. So that's one thing we want to work with families and clients on, is that they need to help their children learn that it's safe and it's okay to have this full range of emotions and to give them expression. And in a minute, you'll see a slide that'll especially kind of remind us why that's so important. First, we'll just do one more of these questions. Reaching out to others during a time of stress, grief, or crisis, A, should be handled by trained professionals. B, is not a good idea if you aren't equipped to solve their problem. C, can be helpful to both people. Connection is essential to coping and healing. Or D, can only be accomplished by in-person contact. Okay, once again, we have about 2/3 of you have answered. I'll give you about 10 more seconds for a few more to sign in. And I'll close this one. And look, 100% of you that replied said it can be helpful for both people. Connection is essential to coping and healing. Yes, this is one of the biggest takeaways I hope you'll get from today. So thank you that you're hearing that, or you already know that, but I'm sure you already knew that, but just that you can reflect on it in this moment and remember that and be guided by that in terms of the work you do and your own personal self-care. All right, that's the last one we'll do for now. And so I would love if people do kind of share in the chat box as I go forward onto the next pieces of some of the ways you do nourish and move your body each day, or your mind or your spirit. And so you'll notice that I'm suggesting you use these questions at certain times in the day. And I brought this up in the very beginning of the morning as well, beginning of the workshop as well. That it's good to have rhythm and sort of guideposts in our day to help give us some structure when all of our other structures have been kind of erased or blurred in this time. So it is good to have consistency and routine, but also to be flexible and kind with ourselves or others around that. And here's what I said I was going to add a little more to that point about why it's important to express our difficult or negative feelings, is because when they're not expressed, they can accumulate and incubate. Stress accumulates, anxiety incubates. And that's what we don't want. So that's why we want to help pull back into balance. Like I did with my daughter on the CVS conversation, right? I let her have that space. I let her have that voice to those angry or hurt or negative feelings, and then helped her come back into balance in a place of compassion and empathy. Just like a person on the balance beam would do. When they start to jiggle and notice they're getting out of balance, they have to be very intentional about pulling back into balance. And that's what these activities are designed for, that you engage and notice your sensory experiences to be intentional about pulling yourself back into balance. So I see we have some comments here: taking a dog for a walk, walking with your child, a lot of walking. I have been walking every day too. And during walking, you can really notice a lot of different sensory experiences, right? The scents in the spring air, the sounds of the birds or a brook of water trickling by, or whatever sounds you might be hearing. The sights of the flowers that are blooming and the trees. And yes, someone made the comment, I walk or exercise every day because it helps with stress and I sleep better. And very soon, in the next few minutes before our time is up, I'm definitely going to be saying a word about sleep. So thank you for acknowledging that. YouTube workout videos, great resource. Thanks for sharing that. I do some YouTube yoga almost several times during the week. So that next question for our daily reflection is, I call it the tea time question. I invite and encourage you to take time in the middle of the day, in the late afternoon. You don't have to drink tea. I call it the tea time question, but have tea or don't have tea, but use it as a time to notice those sensory experiences, right? What is one thing of beauty that I've either seen or heard, tasted or smelled, or even touched today, or even created myself? So we have this evaluation, mental walking. I like that description, mental walking. That's a great picture. Thank you for sharing that. And Tai Chi in the morning and evening walks, FaceTiming with children and grandchildren, great, keeping that sense of connection. So we're getting some good responses here. And when you notice something of beauty, share it. Share it with someone else, because it's in that sharing, again, that's a powerful piece that actually helps strengthen and rebuild those brain pathways that may have been overwhelmed or flooded out or harmed by trauma, grief, or loss. These are the tools that can help rebuild them and build in and nurture and strengthen resilience and growth. It's not just in the noticing of it, it's in the sharing of it. So share it yourself and invite others to share theirs with you. It's going to be a long haul. We can see that now. And I know one of the comments earlier that someone posted was, it's really kind of starting to set in how long this is going to be and how hard this is going to be. And so since it is going to be that long haul, recognizing that we have to be gentle together. Our path to whatever new normal might look like is going to have its bumps and twists in the road. And so the more we can share these positive experiences, the healthier we all can be. Sharing beautiful or funny photos with friends is another great example. Thank you. So now I'm bringing this up to what I call dinner time conversation. Now, first of all, I want to acknowledge that there is power and research behind it in actually having that fellowship of breaking bread together, of actually having a meal with at least one other person. I'm calling it dinner time here. It could be lunch, it could be breakfast. If you live in a space that you're sharing with others, your family members or anyone else, try to find that at least one meal a day that you can share with each other. And if you live alone, try to find a way to, at least for during one of your meals, to connect with another person, whether over the phone, text, FaceTime, your neighbor across the way that you can wave at and hold up, I'm eating now, are you eating? Any of these ways, but have that powerful moment of fellowship over food. It again strengthens resilience and healing and growth. And then during that time, 3 questions to think about and to discuss. And you can use these for journaling. But again, these help build that path of resilience. What is one thing I've learned today? One success I've had today? And one thing that surprised me or made me laugh today. Again, really powerful ways that we can develop and rebuild that resilience and that growth that we want. And those things help us stay connected to one another. We stay connected through our conversations, through doing things collaboratively, maybe even making that meal together, or doing a puzzle together, or sharing, our favorite funny photos with one another. Creates that sense of community and helps us have that sense of compassion. And that connection is one of the most vital parts of not only self-care, but healing and resilience. So now we're getting not only near the end of our time together on this webinar, but if you've followed the flow of my daily reflection questions, we're getting near to the end of the day for the questions. And so we want to end each day well, so we can be equipped and prepared to start each day anew from a place of strength. And so what we mean by that is we really want to let go of those things that cause stress. And when we want to enlarge those things that help us to have that sense of gratitude and hopefulness. So I leave you with the last 3 of the questions for the daily reflection. That would be 3 questions for bedtime. And I really do mean bedtime, like right before you go to bed, because someone mentioned it already, that idea of what helps you sleep better. It's part of self-care is we really need to have good sleep. And for some, when they're in times of crisis or stress, they sleep even more than usual. Like their body just kind of shuts down and they just want to be sleeping a lot. But for many, sleep is really difficult during times of stress or crisis. And so we need to take these extra steps and be intentional, especially at the end of the day, about things that will help us to get better sleep. So this is not the whole toolkit of everything that helps you get better sleep, but these are a few examples that you can add to your list of daily reflective questions that help encourage and promote good sleep, and at the same time help encourage and promote healthy resilience and well-being, and put us in that posture where we're letting go of the things that can hinder that and reflecting on the things that can help with that. So we want to start with, what is one worry or fear I will let go of before I sleep? And we know that, some things we just really need to fully let go of, but many of the worries or fears or concerns that we have are real issues. It's about our kids, it's about our jobs, it's about our community, that we are going to have to talk about and deal with tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So we can't fully just kind of let go of them, like never think about them again. But can we let go of them for this time while we sleep? And here's a little tool to help you do that. Take that worry or concern or fear that might tangle up in your thoughts and keep you lying awake. Write it down on a piece of paper or in a journal. And then put that paper or that notebook in another room, not the room you sleep in. And basically, as you do that action, say, I'm letting go of this worry or fear while I sleep. It will be there tomorrow. I can approach it again, but I'm not going to let it invade my sleep space. I'm not going to bring it into bed with me. So that's a tangible way you can try letting go of that worry or fear. Then what is at least one thing I'm thankful for? And I noticed we just had a comment about having gratitude, right? So having at least, ending your day with at least one, if not more, things that you are thankful for, and kind of ending your day with this sense of gratitude and self-forgiveness. That's a really beautiful comment. And thank you for making that comment, that, that forgiving yourself and having gratitude can really go hand in hand at the end of the day. And then perhaps one of my favorite of all of the reflection questions is, what is one thing that I'm looking forward to tomorrow? Because I've harped on the idea that connection is one of the most important things we can do for caring for ourselves and others. But I would right up there equal with that is this need that we have to have a sense of hope and optimism and nurture those characteristics of hope and optimism. And so if you can end your day with at least one idea that you're looking forward to, at least one thing tomorrow, even if it's just something as simple and small as, that smell of my morning coffee. End your day with that note of something I'm looking forward to. And someone's looking forward to sleeping in. That's awesome. So end your day with that note of hopefulness and optimism. And on that note, we have about 3 or 4 minutes left in our time together. I will stop talking and I will put up this sort of wrap up slide that gives you, kind of pulls back several of the things I've shared in a simplified way. And invite, do you have any questions? Do you have any additional comments you'd like to make in the chat? You will be receiving the PowerPoint, or maybe you already have, as well as that list of the daily reflection questions. So I'm actually going to turn off the PowerPoint now and bring us back to just the main screen. I'm going to put on my own video back again so you can see my face. And I am going to say, last couple minutes are open if you have any questions or comments. So I see here, what recommendations do you have for supervisor to support the well-being of their staff? And I think I teach a whole class on reflective supervision, and I think that's really important. But when a supervisor can encourage their staff to engage in some of these very practices and help their staff to recognize that it's okay that you have these experiences. What can I do? How can I reach out to you? How can I support you? What do you need from me? What will be helpful? Can we make an agenda for our time together? And can you tell me what you need to get out of our time together? So the more that a supervisor can be acknowledging, I want this to be a mutual sense of connection that we're going to have. We're going to do some reflection during this time. And then I'm going to see how I can best support you. That also role models to that person that you want them to care for themselves as well. And then acknowledging some of the things that you do yourself for self-care. You don't have to be overshare and you don't have to cross boundaries, but you can acknowledge that you have some self-care routines as well. Thank you for the question. Any other questions or comments? And I'll also go ahead and just kind of hand it back to you, Maggie, to wrap us up here.
Absolutely. I want to issue a very big thank you to you for providing such a wonderful training. I know that this was the second time I got to hear it, which is great. It helped, especially having the opportunity to reflect on everything that you've said. And I think it resonates a lot with me, and I'm sure with many others. And it's a topic that, maybe others are not as comfortable, talking about. So it's great that that you've made this space for us to have these kinds of conversations and to think about the implications, the mental health implications of what it is that we are dealing with. So I'm very grateful to you for helping to provide this information. We do plan on offering some additional trainings on Mental Health Awareness Month, which were announced, I know, at the bottom of the e-blast, that went out this week, reminding everybody about today's training. But we'll be rolling out some more information on other topics that are similar to this, but tackle the other issues that are involved when we think about mental health, particularly kind of during this crisis. So I want to thank you very much, Sue. There is going to be a brief, there should be a brief survey that pops up here after, and I'd encourage everyone to fill that out. Let us know any feedback. We're always appreciative of that. If it doesn't pop up, I'll also include it in the list of materials that I'll forward to you from Sue that will be included in today's training. Is there anything, Sue, that you wanted to wrap up with?
Thank you. I was looking to see if there were other questions. There didn't seem to be any others, but there was a mention from Lori that you've been using the questions during staff meetings. So that's another way of responding to the person who asked about supervision. It's a way of supporting staff, and those questions can be useful for that. So thanks for sharing that, Lori.
So it's a great point. I think support is the biggest way in which I think managers or anybody in leadership positions can think about those that they are charged with is making sure that they are well supported and that there's a level of understanding that it can go on, that we're all coping differently and we handle the grief and loss differently. So, and thank you so much for today's training. And thank you to all of you. I hope you're able to enjoy some lovely weather this weekend, which could do wonders for the mood. And so we hope that you can take advantage and especially enter into this weekend with Sue's wonderful advice. So
Great. It is beautiful right now where I am sitting, so I'm looking forward to that sunshine. Thank you. Thank you,
yep.
everyone, for your participation and your engagement.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great weekend, and please fill out the survey, and we look forward to hearing from you all again soon. Thanks, Sue.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.